Okay, good morning ladies and gentlemen. As I said, I will put up some videos again for you with regard to our outstanding work. We stopped at the atelectasis and the bronchiectasis last time. I saw you, so we will proceed with the upper respiratory tract infections. Okay, so first of all, we define our respiratory tract infections in upper respiratory tract infections versus our lower respiratory tract infection. Now, our upper respiratory tract infection is an infection that is caused by a microorganism that usually participates or infects the non-gas exchanging upper structures of the respiratory system, which will include then your nasal passages, your pharynx, and your larynx, and all of those are known as your upper respiratory tract infections. So when these three structures is involved in the infection process, we classify them as the upper respiratory tract infections. Okay, so these ones you are, or the examples of these ones you are quite familiar with. That's the common cold that all of us suffer from, otitis media, which is ear infection, sinusitis, pharyngitis, a sore throat, laryngitis, which is infection of the vocal cords, and uncomplicated influenza. Okay, in most of the cases, it is of viral origin, although bacteria may also be involved initially or secondary to the viral infection. Now, what usually happens in this case is a patient will contract an upper respiratory infection that is usually of viral origin. Okay. Then we will drink stuff and antibiotics 90% of the time. For this type of infection, we will use over-the-counter medicines, the ones that you are familiar with, like Corex or Fluzin or Lintagon or those type of things. Okay. The problem is, if the causative thing is a virus, then we will usually not be able to clear the infection with medications like that. But if the patient then have a secondary infection, which is usually bacterial in origin, then we will be able to treat the infection with those type of medications. The same account for antibiotics. Okay, so if, say for instance, you contract a disease like pneumonia, for instance, and it's of viral origin, then you can drink antibiotics till you drop dead. It's not going to help. The antibiotics will only assist in clearing up the secondary infections that you get due to the pneumonia. But the pneumonia itself, if it's from viral origin, the antibiotics won't help, because antibiotics is not prone to killing any viral type of infection. Okay, so it won't work. And that's actually a very important thing to remember when we are dealing with organisms from viral origin. Okay, so all of these infections will initiate our immune and inflammatory responses and will end up in swelling and edema. All of you are familiar with the process of the increase in the permeability, the swelling and edema, and in this case, when the respiratory tract infection is applicable or involved, then usually we have an increase in the amount of mucus production. Okay, and that's why everything starts flowing out of our noses and throats and down our throats when we are dealing with these type of infections, because there's an increase in mucus production. Okay, so if we look at the common pathophysiology, first of all, the candidate or the patient will present with an inflammatory reaction that it will cause. Because it's in the respiratory system, we can have an increase in our mucus production. And then the symptoms of the upper respiratory infection due to our inflammatory reaction can include a headache, low-grade fever, and malaise. And these symptoms are typical of your inflammatory response. Okay, that's the symptoms usually generalized when the patient has an active inflammatory reaction. Then due to the increase in the mucus production, this patient can suffer from congestion. Okay, there can be closure of the nasal passages, excess sputum production, as we know, and then obviously the sputum needs to go somewhere, So we have an increased amount of nasal discharge. Okay. Now, if I ask you, okay, all of you know that there is organisms all around us. Okay, if I touch this mouse, there's bugs on this. If I touch anything around me, there's organisms on it. Okay, so therefore, why don't we contract any type of respiratory infection if we run, say, for instance, open mouth through the streets? Okay, because the air around us, everything is basically polluted with microorganisms. Okay, now the reason why we don't get sick on a constant basis or infected is due to the fact that we have 3 natural protective mechanisms that helps us to prevent from contracting an infection. So the first one that we deal with is our cough reflex. Okay? So in order for us, let me start there, in order for us to get this respiratory infection, a microorganism needs to gain access either to our upper respiratory tract infection or to our lower respiratory tract infection. If the microorganism gains access, then it has the ability to cause disease. Okay? But now our protective mechanisms kicks in. Now the first thing is our cough reflex. Okay? So what happens is as soon as we inhale this microorganism, the body will recognize this microorganism as foreign, and we will initiate a cough reflex. By coughing, we will then be able to expel the microorganism before it has the ability to cause disease. Okay. Now, say for instance the microorganism bypasses the cough reflex, okay, and it's still there. Then we have a second protective mechanism, which is our mucociliary blanket. Okay. Now this is where your mucus-producing cells will trap these foreign particles, specifically then these microorganisms, and the cilia inside our lungs will then beat rhythmically together, and they will expel this foreign material upwards into the respiratory tract up until the time it gets easy for us to cough it out. Okay, so the mucus-producing cells basically engulfs this microorganism, and the cilia then expels it upwards in order for us to get rid of it. Okay, that's the second one. And say for instance it bypasses this protective mechanism as well, then we have our third protective mechanism, which is obviously our immune response. Now, if you are a patient that's suffering from an immunocompromised disease, like say for instance HIV or autoimmune disease or those type of things, then you know that your immune system is compromised, and then obviously these type of patients are much more prone of getting an infection. Now what happens with the immune system? Now the microorganism has bypassed the cough reflex, it bypassed the blanket. Now we are actually, it reaches now our lower respiratory tract infection, and now the body recognizes, but hey, there's something wrong, because this microorganism now starts to create infection. And then we know that an infective process is going on there, so the body will try and clear up the infection by initiating the inflammatory response. It's increased the blood flow to that area. With the increase in blood flow, we send our white blood cell markers to that area, specifically our lymphocytes, macrophages and neutrophils, and then they will attack these foreign bodies through the process of phagocytosis, etc., up until the point when we clear up the infection. Okay, so these are the 3 mechanisms that is in place in order for us to prevent us from getting any respiratory tract infections. Okay, now, if the microorganism, so in order for us to get a disease like pneumonia, a cold, influenza, those type of things, the microorganism needs to bypass all 3 of these protective mechanisms, or it it must be extremely virulent. That means it must be a very extremely aggressive type of organism. Then obviously this will then result in an infection. Okay. Now we go to the smokers. Okay, so those of you that smoke is a little bit of bad news for you. So if you engage in smoking, then unfortunately these protective mechanisms or the work performance of these protective mechanisms are in a way compromised. Okay. Now first of all, the cigarette smoke itself alters your defense mechanism. How does it alter it? First of all, cigarettes contains a product, most of the nicotine, which stimulate mucus production. Okay, so that is usually when you deal with smokers, a lot of them will wake up in the morning and you can hear, but they have a productive cough. Okay, so there's a lot of mucus floating around in the bronchi that they then start to cough out. The other problem is when with your mucociliary blanket, where I told you that the foreign particles is expelled upwards by the cilia fingers, that moves it upwards into your through your respiratory tree. The cigarette smoke or the contents of cigarette smoke will paralyze the cilia. So basically you lose that defense mechanism, it's taken away. So now the foreign particles get trapped inside the lungs. It can't be expelled by the cilia because they are now inactive. Therefore they sit there and they have the ability to cause disease. Okay. So that's just basically what I said there. The smoker's cough, it's what I refer to in the mornings. It's an attempt to expel this thick mucus. And lower respiratory tract infections are more common in smokers. In those exposed to second-hand smoke, especially in the case of infants and children. Okay, so remember, if you are a smoker and you have children, please don't expose them to the second-hand smoke. Okay, although you think it won't make a difference, it indeed will make a difference. Okay, so rather go and smoke your cigarette outside than in the house where your child is. Okay. So the clinical manifestations of our respiratory tract infections, that is usually things that you can think of for yourself. All of us has experienced this. We've got a cough, sneezing and nasal congestion, mucus production, drainage from the nose, and then the post-nasal drip, the fluid running down the throat, headache, sore throat, earache, facial pain and pressure, usually linked to the high intensity of the coughing. You can have a low-grade fever. The low-grade fever is usually very indicative of a viral infection. If the patient presents with a high-grade fever, then we usually know that the patient has bacterial infection. But a low-grade fever is very indicative of a viral infection. And then malaise, that's tiredness. So if the patient, obviously if you have oxygenation problems, you will suffer from fatigue and tiredness. Okay? The diagnostic tools, how are we going to diagnose this disease? We're going to take a history and we're going to do a physical examination of the patient. He will tell us. Luckily, the majority of patients knows about cold and flu symptoms, etc. So it's not a problem for us to diagnose this. Then we will do a full blood count, because on the full blood count we can establish our white cell markers. For instance, we will see whether active infection is present by looking at the patient's white blood cell count. We can then also do a sputum culture, where we can take a little bit of the sputum, we can send it to the lab, we can ask them to culture the sputum for us, to identify the possible microorganism in order for us to prescribe the correct medication that will be effective or sensitive towards that microorganism. Then the complications, if we don't do anything about this, the patient can start suffering from sinusitis, and then ultimately this will usually progress into a lower respiratory tract infection, which will then be either pneumonia or bronchitis that the patient will end up with if we don't treat our upper respiratory tract infection properly or we neglect it. Good. Okay, so here's just a picture of a patient presenting with pharyngitis. You can see that this patient has an extremely red throat, okay, which is very indicative. And then here you can see the tonsils are quite swollen, they're red, they're inflamed. So you know that there's a serious infection going on in this patient. Then laryngitis, which is also classified as upper respiratory tract infection. That is where we get inflammation of the vocal cords. And all of you know that sometimes we have difficulty in speech when a patient presents with laryngitis due to the phlegm or the mucus that starts to accumulate on the vocal cords, which makes it extremely difficult for us to speak. The sounds, in actual fact, doesn't really come out, and in the case of laryngitis, then the patient can lose his ability to voice his speech. Okay, so although he can talk normally, you can't really hear him. Okay, or his voice is much lower than it usually is. Okay, so the upper respiratory tract infections are there. You know them, you're quite familiar with them. That's not for me the most important thing there is. The lower respiratory tract infection, this is the important one for me. With the upper one, if you know about the defenses and those type of things, the other things,